Good to see so many people with their priorities in the right place. Again, I've been asked to take on a topic that deserves book-length treatment and to present it in 15 minutes. So there's going to be a lot of subtleties, a lot of generalizations, but I hope to get across the main point, that what we need today in an era where we're seeing carbon dioxide contributing to the acidification of the world's oceans, where they're predicting the pH factor will drop to 7.8 by the end of this century, which means most of the coral will be gone, most of the species will be gone in the water. And where we're seeing global warming contributing to a higher rate of temperature increase in the Arctic area, which portends the possibility of release of massive amounts of methane, we're really like the frog in that pot of water who isn't aware that the water is heating up. And our taken for granted beliefs are very much like that frog. We're not aware, we're taking for granted that many of the misconceptions passed on from the past in public schools and through our universities are based on a number of misconceptions and hubris. A friend of mine in Mexico recently sent me a paper on the mathematics of the tribe of, which he referred to as the tribe of Europe. And what he was getting at is that this Western form of consciousness, which you can see very clearly in the history of Western philosophy, and if you look at Western philosophy, you see that the main things that they gave us, what continues today, and I'm going to base my thinking on that, is that they gave us the importance of priority of abstract thinking over awareness of ecological intelligence. They gave us an ethnocentric way of looking at the world, and they laid the basis for Enlightenment thinkers who ignored the importance of the cultural commons, and that is all those activities, relationships, skills, forms of knowledge, mentoring, patterns of mutual support that are put down so ruthlessly by referring to them as anybody speaking favorably for them as the Neo-Luddites. And the Enlightenment thinkers set the framework now for us to ignore what those traditions are, what you're calling local, what I'm calling the cultural commons, that is those non-monetized, intergenerational, face-to-face, low toxic, low carbon footprint kind of activities. Okay, the topic. Have I used up 5 minutes? Okay, a long ways to go. I want to frame this discussion of what's problematic about print and data by borrowing the Roman god Janus that had two faces looking in two different directions, which points out that we're not talking about either or progress. We're talking about the possibility that our achievements are also, as Bateson put it, creating double binds for us, and that is they're creating the very problems that we're trying to address and in most cases trying to ignore. So what is there about, so I'm admitting at the outset, I take data seriously, especially the data that scientists are giving us. So what is there about print and data that undermine ecological intelligence? First, let me explain that Descartes and the other philosophers got it wrong. We are all ecological thinkers. That is, we are all responding to local context in terms of emergent, relational, and codependent activities, whether you're standing at a stoplight, engaging in a conversation with somebody else, you're responding to very complex messages that are circulating within that cultural ecology. What we need is a more complex form of cultural intelligence. Many of us are beginning to understand social justice issues as part of ecological intelligence. So we pay attention to language, relationships, how people are privileged or disadvantaged, and so on. That's paying attention to the relationships, to the patterns that connect. We now need to move that to that third level of asking how do various activities, consumer habits, skills, forms of knowledge, and so on, impact our understanding of natural systems, and I referred to those mega changes that are now beginning to take place and affecting people's lives. So what is there about print and data that are problematic? Keep in mind the Janus nature, they're positive, they're very important, they're indispensable. So it's not either or. But what do we need to understand critically in the use of print and data? Well, let me lay out three possibilities that usually are not discussed with students, either in public schools or at universities. First, you can't put any depth of knowledge of an ecology, that is, of a relationship, an activity, of a practice in print. If you want to see the limitations of print, just look at what happens when you're standing on the beach and waves are crashing against the rock. Then you ask, how much of that can you put into print? It's a fragment. And more importantly, what you put into print is immediately dated in addition to being shallow. That doesn't mean we can't update, go to greater depths and so on. But the point is, and this is where we need to challenge this notion that what is in print is objective, it's factual, it plays a particular role in the politics of language and relationships. Secondly, a second point I want to make is that let me summarize that a little in a clear way. What print and data cannot do for us is provide us a knowledge of context. And context involves your taken for granted world, your memories, your relationships, what is being negotiated in those relationships with others in a mentoring activity, and so on. Now, one of the things that happens when we rely upon data and print, that is, when we're teaching students to look at the world that they're going to face and so on. How many of you are aware of the core curriculum? Not too many. How many of you have resisted it? How many of you have gone out on the sidewalk and protested? That is going to set us back for decades. And who were the people behind it? Bill Gates and Rex Tillerson, who's CEO of ExxonMobil, who makes $40 million a year. Teachers have no background, really, for understanding what its limitations are, but it's a movement toward putting more of our knowledge in print and represented it as data appearing on a screen. Okay, what happens when we encounter the printed word on a page or data and printed word on a computer screen? What goes on? What happens is that what is being reinforced is a conduit view of language, a sender-receiver way of understanding what's being communicated. This is absolutely essential for maintaining that there is such a thing as objective knowledge, that there is factual information, that human beings are not complicit in the construction of that knowledge. So what is lost in a conduit or a sender-receiver model of communication? What is lost is really fundamental, and that is that all language is metaphorical. What does that mean? It means that our words carry forward the analogies settled upon in the distant past by people who were under the influence of different cultural assumptions. Let me give you an example. The word woman is a metaphor. It's also a root metaphor, but it's a metaphor that was framed, the meaning of which was framed by people who had all kinds of biases, prejudices, silences, and an inability to see what the human behavior was really about. Okay? So the implications is that when we learn the language of our community, we're learning the thought patterns that are carried forward from the past that in effect reproduce earlier forms of intelligence or lack of intelligence. Secondly, not only are words metaphors, but the interpretive frameworks that we use to make sense of things are based on what are called root metaphors. Patriarchy was a root metaphor. Anthropocentrism is a root metaphor which represents humans as in charge of the world, to name it, to use it, to exploit it. But we have other root metaphors such as mechanism. You see this very prominent in the area of brain research. We see this mechanism prominent in education, agriculture, in all aspects of life. What a root metaphor does, such as mechanism or individualism or progress, is that it excludes other possibilities that are outside the language framework that supports that root metaphor. Increasingly, evolution is becoming a root metaphor, and people are coming up with some really, really frightening ideas, such as the computer science people who are highly educated in a very narrow area, but who totally lack an understanding of the cultures into which their technologies are introduced. But they see the changes they introduce, that is the loss of various forms of knowledge, the marginalization of jobs, the forms of knowledge that can't be encoded in print or in data. They see that as part of an evolutionary process. So what is happening is, and they're now talking about how humans are going to be bypassed by superintelligent computers, and that we're now entering what they call the post-biological phase of evolution. The root metaphor here is progress. And if you read Michiko Kaku's The Future of the Mind, where he's talking about the possibility of what the scientists, what these Promethean figures are going to do in terms of our intelligence, our memories, and so on, you find that they only see it in terms of progress. It's interesting that all the books I've read on computer scientists talking about how the world is going to be changed and improved and globalized, they never mention what is being lost. But I think your ecological intelligence tells you you've lost privacy. You've lost security in that your activities, your economic well-being and so on can be hacked. There's now this new program called ransomware, where your computer can be shut down until you pay a fee, and it has to be paid in bitcoins. So now, one third point that I want to make about print and data. Given the fact that we think within the language framework that we learn when we're born into a language community, which means ecologically, the ecology of language is telling us that we are reproducing earlier patterns of thought. We are taking these patterns of thought for granted. And then at the same time, we're reading what people are writing and what they are telling us about data. And we're saying, well, that's factual, that's objective, that has political power, and that will adapt our decisions to what the information and data are telling us. I see the 2 minutes. Data. The point that I want to make is that the writer, whether it's an Aldo Leopold or a hack, only writes what her or his interpretive framework makes available to them. So if they're not aware of how their own thought processes encode the prejudices, the silences, the ways of understanding reality, then they will reproduce that as their story or their written account. Also, what is written, whether it's in print or as data, is interpreted. And the people who interpret what's in these technologies also is influenced by her or his taken for granted assumptions, which reflects what has been encoded in the language that they have taken for granted. The critical point is that public schools and universities do not help students understand the metaphorical nature of their language. They continue to reinforce the idea of language as a sender-receiver process of communication. They continue to reinforce the idea that there's factual knowledge. And what we're hearing from the other speakers here is that the West is engaged in a very powerful process of colonization. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to look at the process of linguistic colonization of our present by our past. Now that is a tough nut to crack, because like the frog, we're all very comfortable with our vocabulary, and damn it, we just don't want to take on the challenge of learning something that we haven't thought about before. And I think that's the crisis we face.
Any Navajos in here? In Indian country, you could say you could throw a stone and you'll probably hit a Navajo anywhere you go. But Yat A She Jihan Gearon Yenisha, Twitch Eating Nish, Donna Kaitlijan Bashes Chin, Last Che Dash Che Donna Kaitlijan Dashanadle, Tehatoy Dan Nasha. So I just introduced myself in Navajo, my 4 clans. As was mentioned, I'm Navajo on my mother's side and African American on my father's side. And I grew up on the eastern side of the Navajo Nation in Arizona, a place called Old Sawmill, Arizona. Again, my talk is entitled Navigating Contradictions, a Just Transition for the Navajo Nation. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Navajo Nation. Anybody been to the Navajo Nation? All right, okay. So there it is on a map of the United States. The Navajo Nation is bigger than the state of West Virginia. It's in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, and is home to 110 different communities. Our median income on the Navajo Nation is $7,500 a year. There's about half of our population that lives on the reservation and half of our population that lives off. So 200,000 or so on, 200 or 1,000 so off, mostly in the major cities of the Southwest and border towns like Phoenix, Albuquerque, Flagstaff, that's where I live, Gallup, New Mexico, Page. We always hover between an unemployment rate of 46% and 54%. Recently, it's been up to 70% unemployment. And another interesting fact is that 75% of all unelectrified homes in the entire United States are on our reservation. So it's very common to, when I first grew up and lived with my grandma, to not have electricity or running water on the reservation. Very little infrastructure, lots of dirt roads and all that kind of stuff. It's bad in one way, but it's also really awesome in another way. That's the way I think about it. I appreciate growing up that way. I think a lot of us do too. The Navajo Nation also has a long history of an extractive economy. So I mentioned I was from a place called Old Sawmill because there was an actual sawmill there a while ago, and that was the first resource that was taken off of our reservation in a place called the Cheska Mountains. But there's also a long history of uranium mining and oil and gas development. There's a huge fracking boom going on now on the eastern side, New Mexico side of the reservation, and of course coal mining. And that's what I'm going to focus on now. Okay, so here we are in Arizona. I work for an organization called the Black Mesa Water Coalition, and our work focuses in one region of the reservation called Black Mesa. Traditionally, our territories is surrounded by 4 mountains, 2 in Colorado, 1 in New Mexico, and 1 in Arizona. The San Francisco Peaks and Flagstaff, where I live, is our western boundary. Within those territories, there's also 2 mountain chains. I mean, some people would say they're mountains and some would not. One is Cheska Mountains, which I mentioned, and then the other is Black Mesa. So these represent a wife and husband, female, and the male within our homelands, and so has many associated teachings with those. Black Mesa is the female. Black Mesa is home to 11 to 17 to 21 communities, depending on who you're talking to, and if you're counting Navajo and Hopi communities. The Hopi reservation is right in the middle of the Navajo reservation. And I think you can see it on this map too. So they're also on Black Mesa. Black Mesa is also home to 2 coal mines, the Black Mesa mine and the Kayenta mine, that were started in the early 70s. The I'm not going to spend too much time on the Black Mesa mine, but you can see that it used to provide coal to the Mojave generating station through a 273-mile-long coal slurry pipeline. So under Black Mesa is also a pristine aquifer called the Navajo Aquifer. And that's really how our organization started, was to protect the water in the Navajo Aquifer, which was being pumped up and used at the rate of 4,400 acre-feet per year to just transport coal 273 miles. We were part of the struggle to shut that down in 2005, and we did. Yay! Okay. Now, the Kayenta mine provides coal by rail to the Navajo generating station in Page, New Mexico. The Navajo generating station is 2,250 megawatts, making it the largest coal-fired power plant in the entire western United States. It's also the only coal-fired power plant that's owned by our federal government, majority owned by the Bureau of Reclamation. It was created to pump water. See this big canal? It's called the CAP, Central Arizona Project. So it was created to pump water uphill and then down into the valleys of central and southern Arizona. So people who've been to Phoenix and Tucson, Scottsdale, you know that those are smack dab in the middle of the desert, right? So this is how they're actually able to get their water, and the lifestyle that they have down there with swimming pools and golf courses and misters and all of that kind of stuff is because of the cheap electricity and cheap energy that we of the Navajo Nation have provided. Okay, so here are two of our founders. The guy on the left, Roberto, runs our Green Economy program. We do want to change that name, but they're looking out over the mine. And this is a slide just to show you, I think you can probably guess that there are many detrimental impacts from coal mining and coal-fired power plants. Impacts to the Navajo Aquifer, contamination and overuse of water, health impacts, relocation impacts. Probably many of you are somewhat familiar with the issues of Big Mountain and forced relocation of Navajo and Hopi communities to make way for coal mining. Many health problems. In Page, of course, the communities, Navajo communities that live around that power plant as well are also experiencing a lot of health impacts, developmental problems, respiratory problems. And there's also social impacts beyond that. So I told you that Black Mesa was a female mountain in our cultural teachings. And I guess spirituality, for lack of a better word. So what does it mean when you dig and take and beat up and mess up that female? You know, what does that say about our culture? We say that the land and our homelands reflect how healthy our people are. And it's unhealthy right now, to say the least. And I was asked to speak on this panel because I often say this one statement, which is that this kind of fossil fuel development, of course, was intentional. It was pushed on us through various means, but the impact has been that it's made us, as Navajo people, economically dependent on our own cultural destruction. That's the situation that we're in. And how do we get out of that situation? With 70% unemployment, you know, this coal mine, this coal-fired power plant provides 1,000 jobs, which doesn't seem that much at all, but when there are no jobs available, it means a lot. So how do we break ourselves out of this bind that we're in? That's the challenge that we're faced with. These are our goals. They're kind of long, so I won't read them all. But the main point of these is that there's an emphasis, that our emphasis is on healing, that decolonization and healing is an important part of our work, healing as individuals and as communities and as our culture. And also we uphold our traditions within our organizations and a focus on replenishing those, and then the last is how can we transition our economy to actually reflect those things. We have a few projects that we work on. We're calling them pilot projects at this point, and we use the term just transition. Do you guys understand what that means, or? Okay, So I don't have an easy definition for you either. But I think the point is just, yes, and transition, and meaning it's going to take time. So we know the situation that we're in right now. We know that it's bad, and we know where we want to go. Yes, our future of language revitalization, cultural revitalization, useful work, healthy communities, healthy lands, healthy water. Just transition means how do we get from A to B? How do we actually make that happen? And especially in the absence of, some giant catastrophe or zombie apocalypse, that might put everyone back to square zero, what can we do to actually make that transition possible and work for us? So we have a couple of things. First is the Navajo Wool Market Improvement Project. So part of our work is trying to figure out what do Navajo people already do? So it's not like, oh, what's this new industry we can come in and teach you, but what are you already doing? And what are the cultural values surrounded by those, and how can we build off of that? You probably have heard of Navajo rugs. For those of you who have visited the reservation, maybe you ate mutton. Sheep is a big part of our culture, and we're wool producers, and we eat lots of mutton, and it's part of our family gatherings and everything. So our wool project is, first we did some research about what happens to all the wool that people produce. And we found out that they're sold in border towns, like Gallup. Then there's like a giant auction in Roswell, New Mexico, where it's sold to a lot of companies in Texas, and then they go on to make products. And so our idea is, how can we actually cut out all these middlemen and actually have the producers of these products be the ones who are getting paid for it, right? I mean, that's a problem of capitalism, is the people who actually do the work and produce our resources are not paid for them. Some other person way up here in offices. So we do trainings. You can see at the top left. We've brought in and made connections with actual wool buyers to just come and teach us, what are ways to shear your sheep, what are ways to breed your animals, what are ways to separate your wool, what are ways to clean your wool in order to get you a higher price. And where most people were getting maybe 25 cents a pound for their wool, we've gotten it in some cases up to $1.25 a pound for community members. And last year was our third year hosting a wool buy. So our first year we did one in Pinon, Arizona, and then last year we did it in 8 different communities. And you can see, in this bottom right corner, like how much wool, Navajo people produce. We filled up like 4 of these giant trucks or something like that. So, I mean, that capacity is there, and I think what we've tried to do is prove that it is viable for people who carry on this traditional way of lifestyle to also be able to supplement their income with it as well. And then the question becomes, what other infrastructure can we build on the Navajo Nation to support this kind of industry? There's a community called Hard Rock in Black Mesa who actually did a feasibility study on whether they can create a wool washing facility. And it was deemed unfeasible because there are not enough water resources. Yet now, 15 miles away from that community is the mine. And they use as much water as they want for free. So not only is this a way to get people money, but it's a way to actually challenge our economy and the use of the very precious resources that we have in that region. Next. So those were the results from the wool buy in the past few years. So I think the first year we sold maybe 15,000 pounds, and last year was like 60,000 pounds. And so just like with basic organizing, not to say that it's not a lot of hard work, but just with basic organizing, we actually have made a big difference to the point where we now have companies from Texas being like, where's all the Navajo wool? Can we come to your wool buys? And it's like, well, only if you're willing to pay, this higher price to community members for it. So even with just a little bit of effort, we've made things a lot better and proven it viable. Okay, our other project is the Food Sovereignty Project. The Food Sovereignty Project is basically what many of the panelists talked about on the previous panel, is how do we revitalize our food systems. We have the same health impacts that many communities have, especially with the impacts of colonization, the forced use of commodity foods that we weren't able to herd and wander as we used to be. We were confined to a reservation, etc. So this project is really about trying to find out how can we improve our food systems, not to sell necessarily to other places, but to provide for ourselves, to provide for the schools, to provide for the communities, to provide for the senior centers, and to rebuild the community and the clanship systems that used to have cultural roles in producing food for everybody. I'm already running out of time, so I'm going to speed through this next bit. So these are kind of, I would say, our long-term vision of how our traditional economy could be supported again. And I think the end goal is not an economy where we provide things that we then sell to outside communities, but to support ourselves. The Black Mesa Solar Project, I think, is a good example of that, my title, Navigating Contradictions. And the idea here is that our job basically as a Navajo Nation at this point is to be a battery for major southwestern cities, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, etc. Is there a way that we can better provide that energy? Can we use the reclaimed mining lands that have already gone through mining, can't be used for anything else for a large-scale solar project? The difference is that we would be owners of it. We don't own the Navajo generating station. We don't own any of that. We don't make any money back from the energy that we actually provide. But if we did actually own a project like this that could come back into our community and then be reinvested into other types of economic development, a couple that I just shared with you. So that's the general idea of that project. And I'm going to end there. This is my information up here. And I just wanted to make a plug for myself that I have a workshop tomorrow too, where I want to talk about partnerships. We have a lot of people who are interested in these kind of projects, but also to talk about what kind of partnerships might be most useful. So thank you for your time.
It's really an honor to be here, and I'm especially glad to be able to publicly thank Helena for her decades of work. You know, as these conferences exemplify, she has really been relentless in her pursuit of seeking ways of living that promote exuberance and relations that nurture and sustain life. And today I want to talk about beauty, which is a relation of exuberance that has been much maligned in our modern world. In fact, when I tell people that I'm writing about beauty, sometimes they laugh out loud. I once told an artist I was writing about beauty, and she blurted out, "I hope you're not writing about Botox." But more often people are baffled, and actually I would say both are fair reactions. If you put the word beauty into a Google search, you will find hundreds of thousands of references to plastic surgery, to fashion, and to makeup. In our contemporary usage, an esthetician is a person who's trained in the arts of manicure, facials, and eyebrow shaping. Also called beauticians. Their specialty is almost always female beauty. So we live at a time in our culture when beauty has become a trivial value. We speak of beauty as something that is merely, only in the eye of the beholder. And when we say that, we make beauty a value that is relative, subjective, and a mere opinion that cannot be argued. We also say then that beauty is skin deep, that it's superficial and trivial, and so not worth arguing about. And then we pile up other accusations. We say it's dangerous to girls and women. It's sexist, it's racist, it's elitist, it's hedonistic, and there's good evidence for all of these things. We deride beauty as a tool for selling anything and everything. And finally, many of us, I think, in this room, condemn beauty as a distraction from the great unraveling of civilization that's underway. So I know that in asking you to take beauty seriously today is asking you to suspend a deep cultural convention. But here's the thing. If we're going to shift the current economic paradigm, we must take beauty seriously and return it to a place of importance in the world and in our love for the world. Beauty is so clearly a part of our experience of being alive and encountering the livingness of other beings that it really is astounding that we've been talked out of talking about beauty. Beauty is one of the plain facts of our experience. It's a deep part of our evolutionary memory. And it's kept alive in our daily consort with the world. We associate beauty with life-affirming conditions. When we have, what we have come to identify as beautiful are the millions of life patterns that enable and express life. Beauty is not a mere sentimental human opinion. It is not owned by the world of art, and it's not owned by the world of fashion. It's what we name those experiences of life that encourage and support freshness and zest so that life can continue. For most of Western history, and this is really interesting to know, that for most of Western history, beauty was understood as fundamental to the structure of the cosmos. In fact, the word cosmos is Greek for the word order. And the kind of order that was assumed was an aesthetic order, an order of harmony and an order of proportion. So here's the really important thing. The story of how beauty was transformed from a fundamental dimension of the cosmos to a personal opinion is part of the story of how we have been talked out of caring for the natural world and talked into caring for this very abstract thing called the economy. The same history that turned the natural world into a commodity for our use turned beauty into the stock in trade of cosmologists who now put your face in order. Convinced of the deadness of nature, and then the triviality of beauty, we moderns have colluded in stripping the natural world of all value except its value as a resource for human purposes. And we have accepted as some kind of non-negotiable law that our cities and homes should be built cheaply and crudely, degrading our immediate experience of the world and ourselves becoming deadened by it. So the loss of beauty and the loss of ecological integrity are intertwined. A world in decline is a world that has become less beautiful. The great conservationist, probably a good conversationalist too, Aldo Leopold called beauty the key log in unjamming the whole mess made by economics and scientific materialism. Beauty, he maintained, is fundamental to an ecological worldview. And if we're ever going to break out of the mechanistic framework that bears much responsibility for the deterioration of the planet, we must reimagine the world so that it's possible to speak of it as intrinsically valuable and resurrect beauty as a dimension of that value. I want to give you an example, then, of a consequence of our neglect of beauty as a value. In Western North Carolina, I now live in Western North Carolina, and in Avery County, it's up in the mountains, in the 1980s, a developer proposed the building of a condominium on the ridge of a mountain called Sugar Mountain. That ridge is part of these gorgeous Appalachians, and it overlooks the Appalachian Trail, where the trail intersects with the boundaries between Tennessee and North Carolina. In the springtime, it's covered with gorgeous rhododendrons, and this is a picture from the fall. Just get those wonderful golden colors. If you look out from this part of the ridge, you will just see that sea of blue-green mountains that's so iconic of the Appalachians. The condominium project proposed jobs, new housing, and an increase in tourism in an economically depressed region. The residents of Avery County were eager for all these things. What could go wrong? So here we go. Which of these buttons do I choose? Is it the green? It's the yellow? Okay. It's the, there it is. Okay, here we go. Here's what the condo project looks like. The Sugar Top condominium is 131 feet tall and can be seen in every season from a distance of 50 miles away, looking, I think, like a misplaced Las Vegas casino. It's a landmark in travel guides. Did I get a new one? Yeah. So if you open a travel guide to Western North Carolina, here's how it'll be described. As massively ugly and a scar on the scenic beauty of the area. Just what you want in a travel guide. It was not until after the foundation was poured that the public realized that the condo project was going to be an unbelievable eyesore. It was then that the president of the development company had to publicly defend the project. Here's what he said. Oops. Uh-oh. Now what did I do? Here's what he said. What is world-class to one person is not world-class to another. Some like red ties, some like green ties. View sheds, he implied, are no different from neckties. A ridge line with a 10-story tower is no better and no worse than a ridge story that is in its natural state. In other words, he justified ridgetop development on the basis of aesthetic relativism. Its beauty as merely in the eye of the beholder, and not as a quality of the biotic community. Just to be clear, the modernist logic works like this. As soon as you say beauty is only in the eye of the beholder, you make it a private value, a matter of personal taste. And then, because there's no objective measure of something that's a matter of personal taste, it's excluded from public discussion and decision-making. Personal opinion counts for very little when it comes to planning and zoning commissions. The consequence is that we're unable to talk publicly about a shared experience of value that is not an economic value. Even though we know beauty to be a cherished fact of our experience, we find ourselves silenced by our incapacity to speak about it. And so economics remains the sole arbiter of public value, riding roughshod over our fundamental desire for beauty. Now, I want to tell you one more thing that the company president said in his defense of Sugar Top. And this one thing takes us deeper into the logic of economism. Remember, the first thing he said was that some people like red ties, some people like green ties, and so he reduced aesthetic judgment to opinion. But then he said this. Oop. There it is. Sorry. Aha. Everybody who's rich desires to be on top of a mountain, period. And with this statement, he conceded that beauty is not simply a matter of red or green ties, but that in fact there is a deep-seated desire for beauty, and so deep-seated that all people want it, and some are willing to pay a lot for it. And now we arrive at the madcap reckoning that is the consequence of the economic monopoly on value. As beauty becomes rarer, it becomes more valuable, just as economic theory would have it. And as it becomes more valuable, only the wealthy can afford it. But what is it that the wealthy want? They want the very thing that was made rare after it was devalued in the first place as nothing more than personal opinion. The first step in untwisting this mess is to admit that beauty is a plain fact of our experience of the world. It is not simply a private, subjective judgment. It is an experience that we share. It should not be a luxury the 99% can't afford. The second step is to refuse the modern world's devaluing of beauty, except as a strategy for selling more and more stuff by making more and more people feel unbeautiful. Beauty's real vitality rests on the reanimation and the revaluing of the natural world. Oh, I know I'm going to end with that, but let me give you the ocean first. There. The natural world is teeming with life and filled with value. And beauty is a significant, life-affirming form of that value. It is part of the structure of life, and when we encounter it, we feel enlivened by it. Our continued trivialization of the value of beauty is evidence of the unremitting grip of the modern world on us. Philosophical and economic materialism required the marginalizing of beauty. Just so, the reintroduction of beauty as a public value will serve to break the exclusive control of economics as the determiner of worth. We need a reintroduction of non-economic value into the world, both ethics and aesthetics. Beauty understood as the name for the value associated with aliveness, with feeling, and with sensitivity calls us to a different relation with the natural world and with each other. And in closing, so long as we assume that moral and aesthetic values are merely subjective, so long as we seek to make sense out of the world in purely economic terms, we will end up making decisions that undermine human society and undermine the wider ecology. We cannot change this culture. We cannot protect wilderness, shape a world in which we wish to live, unless we are willing to speak out for the importance of non-economic value, including beauty. Thank you.
You are amazing, and I love you all. And I love the work that you're doing. I've been talking with people for the last few days and being reinvigorated and inspired by all the wonderful things you're doing, both here in Portland, in Seattle, across the country, and from overseas. And all the things you're doing, from community gardens to prison visitation programs to DIY upcycling, all of these things are excitingly contributing to a new economics that exists beyond capitalism. It's a not-for-profit economy that's emerging. And to begin with, I'd like you to pause for 15 seconds and see what are the images or the words that come up for you when I say the words not-for-profit or non-profit. Take 15 seconds to feel what those words are. So could I grab from the audience a few of the words that came up in relation to non-profit or not-for-profit? Sorry? Difficult. Struggling. Passion. Unselfish. Values-based mission. Relationships. Corporate funded. Resilient. Okay, just one more. Greater good. Foundations. Thank you so much. This is great because I grew up in the 1980s, and all the words you've just mentioned were the words that I associated with not-for-profit organizations. They were charity-dependent organizations. They were based largely on volunteer efforts and support. And the exciting thing is that over the last 20 and 30 years, what we understand as not-for-profit has totally changed. In the latest study that was done across 27 different nations, including the US, Canada, UK, and Australia, 43% of not-for-profit organizations' revenue is now self-generated. Why has this happened? Well, of course, the boom and bust cycle built into capitalism meant that not-for-profit managers found that when there was a bust, all of their funding dropped out. So they started to look to resilient measures to respond to that. And they built business models in under their organizations. And here I'm talking not just about 501c3 non-profit organizations. I'm talking about community land trusts, consumer cooperatives, co-housing, all sorts of things that exist in a model that is not for profit in the sense that any profit that is made in the business activity associated with the entity is put back in to the organization, is refunneled in a generative process rather than the extractive process that sits underneath the for-profit capitalistic system. Now, many people have put forward some alternatives for what we need to do in relation to the two main crises that we face. Massive financial inequity, where 75 people own and control more than half of the world's wealth, and the climate crises that we're familiar with. And the standard responses go like this. We open up the market and make it a more free market, and we know what historically that does for inequity. It defies physics in the way that the money just trickles upwards. And at the other end of the spectrum, when we have state-centered or planned approaches or heavy market regulation, there are some important deficits that exist within that model because, as we've seen in the past in the Cold War, when power is centralized, it generally doesn't work very well for any individual within the wider community. And it actually has a stifling effect when you look at innovation, both in terms of social and technological, when we are heavy-handed in this space. So these two approaches, both of them at different ends of the spectrum, still engage with a notion that we can have for-profit business, that we can privatize wealth through our business systems. The fundamental problem with the privatization of wealth, and with people not saying, here's an economics of enough where I can cap my income based on my wage, is that it has a centralizing tendency. Any for-profit system will always see, over time, a rising wealth inequality. And that's essentially a message that sits underneath Thomas Piketty's latest work as much as anything. The message I'm here to share with you in these last few minutes is that a very exciting alternative has been emerging, where we actually, if you look at business competitiveness over time, and you compare, for example, a joint stock corporation that is not interested in environmental issues compared to one that is, versus a state-owned enterprise, versus a worker cooperative, a consumer cooperative, a not-for-profit enterprise. If you look at the spectrum of business entities, legal models of the firm, what the data is showing is that not-for-profit organizations are increasingly outcompeting the equivalent for-profit organizations, and worker co-ops are outcompeting the ones further to the right on that spectrum as well. Green businesses that are corporations are outcompeting the non-green ones. In other words, there is an arc of the economic universe that actually bends towards equality. We actually are seeing a shift in competitiveness where capitalism brings itself to its own end by allowing a competitive marketplace in which not-for-profit business actually outcompetes for-profit business. Now, I'd love to talk with people about this, about the work we've done over the last 5 years that will be coming out in our book, How on Earth, Flourishing in a Not-for-Profit World by 2050, and to go into all the details about taxation, inflation, debt, fractional reserve banking, all the things that we looked at, that every turn we made, we realized that the more businesses that are not-for-profit, such as every credit union in the US, for example, which is a not-for-profit financial institution, the more it shifts in that direction, the more we actually start to see a world that goes beyond capitalism. And it actually works. We've modeled it in terms of how it works in terms of redistribution. It functions, it's effective. We engage with all of the challenges that exist in the non-profit model and talk about things like the NFL not-for-profit organization CEO salary of $39 million. And we engage with those things, and there's a way that actually works out beyond that. So to end, I'd like to just share a little story that you may be familiar with about Joseph Heller. author of Catch-22. He was at a party out on, off the east coast of the US, and it was for an investment banker of his putting on a big party, and his friend Kurt came up to him and said, "Joseph, you must be really depressed here at this event because this guy earns more in a day than you'll earn in the whole course of your book sales throughout your lifetime." And Joseph said to him, "Doesn't bother me." And Kurt said, "Why is that?" And Joseph said, "Because I've got something that he'll never have. Enough."
In every corner of the world, we are being pressured by a monoculture, a global consumer monoculture. It is being pushed by our governments who have a blind idea of growth and development.
What we need is not scaling up of those solutions, but scaling out of those solutions, replication in millions of these variety of solutions, innovative solutions that are emerging. It's quite possible.
What we need to do is to actually create platforms in which these sorts of initiatives are able to get together, are able to synergize, are able to actually build those larger narratives, are able to begin to change the public discourse.
We're trying to create an alliance, an international alliance for localization, because we need a united no, one giant no to a continuation of that system. And at the same time, we need to see ourselves as actually part of an enormous movement involving hundreds of millions of people that are saying many yeses to diverse ecosystems, diverse cultures, diverse identities. This is about reclaiming our right to be who we are in our different ways of being. It's about reclaiming the diversity that is life.